My best friend of 14 years called me from my husband's phone on a Tuesday afternoon to tell me he was leaving me for her, and she wanted me to hear it from someone who loved us both. That sentence still sounds impossible when I say it out loud. 14 years. She had been in my wedding. She held my hand in the hospital when I miscarried at 11 weeks. She knew the name we had picked out. She knew everything. I was standing in the parking lot of the Whole Foods on Elm Street when the call came in. My husband's name lit up my screen, and I answered without thinking, already planning to ask him whether we needed more coffee. Instead, I heard her voice, calm, almost gentle, like she was delivering news she had rehearsed. "I think you deserve to hear this from me directly," she said. "We've been together for 8 months. He's going to tell you tonight, but I didn't want it to be a shock." I stood next to my car with a bag of groceries in one arm, and I said nothing for so long that she asked if I was still there. "I'm here," I said. "I'm sorry, I really am. But you and I both know things between you two haven't been right for a long time." I hung up. I put the groceries in the back seat. I drove home. I did not cry. I think that surprised me more than anything else. That I did not cry. I just kept thinking about the miscarriage, about her holding my hand, about the fact that she had probably already been sleeping with my husband at our dinner table the last time she sat across from me and asked how I was doing. 8 months. She had been looking me in the eyes for 8 months. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to back up, because the story doesn't start in that parking lot. It starts with me noticing things I didn't want to notice, things I told myself were nothing because the alternative explanation was one I wasn't ready to face. My husband and I had been married for 9 years. We met in our late 20s when we were both working in Denver. He was in commercial real estate. I was doing financial auditing for a mid-size accounting firm. We got married in a small ceremony in Colorado. 70 people, September, the mountains in the background. My best friend was my maid of honor. She gave a speech that made everyone cry. She talked about how she had watched me wait for someone worth choosing, and she was so glad I had finally found him. I have thought about that speech a lot in the past year. For most of our marriage, things were genuinely good, not perfect. No marriage is, but solid in the ways that mattered. We bought a house in the suburbs outside of Denver. We talked about children. We took vacations to places we had never been. He was ambitious and driven, sometimes to the point of distraction, but I understood that. I had my own career, my own goals. We were two people building something together. The shift started about 1.5 years ago, maybe 2 years, though I didn't recognize it as a shift at the time. I thought it was stress. He had started a new venture, a small commercial property development partnership with 2 other investors, and the first 18 months of building something like that are brutal. Late nights, constant phone calls, weekends that evaporated into work. I gave him room because that is what you do when you believe in someone and you believe in what they're building. But the phone started going face down on the table. The passcode changed without explanation. He started taking calls in the garage and coming back inside with an expression that was too carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that takes effort. I told myself it was business stress. I told myself I was projecting. I told myself a lot of things. My best friend, meanwhile, had become closer to us as a couple in those same 18 months. She was between relationships, and we had her over for dinner often. She and my husband had always gotten along well. Easy conversation, similar sense of humor, and I was glad for that. I was glad my 2 favorite people enjoyed each other's company. I thought it meant things were working the way they were supposed to. I should have asked more questions. I kept choosing not to. The night after that phone call, I sat in our kitchen and waited. He came home at the usual time, and I watched him move through the routine. He's on the hook, jacket on the chair, and I noticed the exact moment he registered that something was wrong. My face must have given it away because he stopped in the middle of the kitchen and said my name like a question. "She called me," I said. "From your phone." He went very still. 8 months, I said. "That's what she told me. 8 months. He started talking immediately, the way people do when they've been caught and their brain is trying to generate a path forward faster than they can think. It wasn't what I thought. It had been a mistake. It had happened gradually, and he hadn't known how to stop it. He still loved me. He had always loved me. He was going to end things with her. I let him finish. Then I asked him one question. Did she know we were going through IVF consultation last spring? He blinked. What? We were seeing Dr. Harmon in April, talking about options after the miscarriage. I told her about every appointment. Did you ever mention it to her? Did you talk about it while you were together? I watched his face go through something I couldn't quite name. Guilt, maybe. Or the specific shame of someone who realizes the full scope of what they've done. Yes, he said quietly. That was the moment I understood that this was not a mistake. Mistakes don't last 8 months while a woman watches her best friend grieve a pregnancy and says nothing. This was a choice made over and over again by both of them. Go stay somewhere else tonight, I said. I need to think. He went, and the moment the door closed, I sat down on the kitchen floor and made myself stay with the full weight of what had just happened. I didn't let myself minimize it or rush past it or start problem solving too soon. I just sat with it. And then, after about an hour, I got up and went to my home office and started doing what I do professionally. I looked at the data. I am a financial auditor. My entire career is built on the skill of finding what people would prefer to hide, discrepancies in records, patterns that don't add up, numbers that tell a story the narrative is trying to contradict. I am methodical. I am patient. And I do not present findings until I am certain they will hold. I started with our joint accounts. What I found in the next 3 hours surprised me, and I am not someone who surprises easily. There were charges I hadn't seen, small, plausibly deniable, the kind of thing that disappears in the noise of a 2-income household if you're not looking carefully. A hotel in Boulder from a weekend he had told me he was visiting a development site. A restaurant reservation at a place I'd never heard of, charged the same evening I had gone to my book club and come home to find him already in bed. Charges from a florist twice, in months when I had received no flowers. I did not confront him with any of it. I documented it. The next morning I called the one person in my life who had no connection to either of them, my college roommate, who had moved to Seattle years ago and existed entirely outside my current social circle. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What do you need?" "I need a recommendation for a private investigator who handles infidelity cases in Colorado," I said. "Someone good, someone discreet." She had a name within the hour. His name was Paul, former law enforcement, 11 years in private investigation. I met him at a coffee shop the following week and walked him through everything I had found. He was quiet and professional, and he asked exactly the right questions. He told me what he could document legally, what the timeline would look like, and what his rate was. I hired him on the spot. Over the next 6 weeks, I went about my life. I went to work. I cooked dinner on the nights my husband was home. I attended a birthday party for a mutual friend where my best friend was also present, and I sat across from her and passed her the salad dressing and asked about her sister's new baby. She looked me directly in the eyes and asked how I was doing. "Tired," I said. "Work has been intense." She nodded with genuine sympathy. I excused myself to use the restroom and stood over the sink in the bathroom for 30 seconds with my hands gripping the counter. Then I dried my hands and went back to the table. 6 weeks is a long time to carry something like that, but I needed what Paul was building. I needed the complete picture before I made any move because I understood, the way you understand things when your job is finding what's hidden, that any confrontation without documentation is just one person's word against another's, and the person with more to lose will fight harder. Paul delivered his first report at the 4-week mark. It confirmed what I already knew, but in the specific, time-stamped, photographable way that makes something real rather than suspected. It also contained something I hadn't expected. My best friend had been through something similar before. Not an affair exactly, but a pattern. Paul had found 2 separate incidents through entirely legal research into public records and professional network contacts where she had been named in the dissolution of marriages within her social circle. One was almost 7 years ago, another about 4 years back. Neither had become public. Both couples had divorced quietly. She had moved on each time, maintained her friendships with everyone involved through a combination of charm and carefully managed sympathy, and positioned herself as a supportive presence who just happened to be nearby when things fell apart. I sat with that report for a long time. She wasn't careless. She wasn't someone who stumbled into these situations by accident. She was someone who had learned that proximity to other women's husbands, sustained over time, framed as friendship and concern, was a strategy that worked, and it had worked twice before me. Maybe more times that Paul hadn't found yet. I thought about the women from those previous relationships. I wonder whether anyone had ever told them the full scope of what had happened, or whether they had simply ended their marriages not knowing they were part of a pattern. I scheduled a call with Paul and told him to keep building the file. The call I had been dreading came on a Thursday evening, 3 days before I had planned to have the conversation myself. She called my personal cell this time, her own phone, not his, and asked if she could come by. She had something she wanted to say in person. I said yes because I was ready. She arrived 40 minutes later in the kind of outfit people wear when they want to seem casual but have clearly thought about it. She sat down across from me in the living room and folded her hands in her lap and said she knew this was hard, and she wanted me to know how much she valued our friendship, and that she hoped we could eventually find a way through this. I looked at her the way I look at a spreadsheet that doesn't balance. "How many times have you done this?" I asked. She blinked. "Excuse me? This isn't the first marriage in your social circle that you've been involved in ending. I know about at least 2 others. There are probably more." I watched the color shift in her face. Not a blush, something colder. A recalibration. "I don't know where you're getting your information," she said carefully. "You called me from my husband's phone to tell me he was leaving me for you," I said. That call from that phone in that moment, that wasn't love. That was a performance. You've done this before and you've gotten away with it because your victims were too blindsided, too ashamed, or too afraid of losing the social support network to say anything publicly. I'm not any of those things. She leaned forward slightly. I think you are in shock and you're looking for a way to make sense of something painful by turning it into something sinister. What happened between your husband and me happened between 2 adults who don't, I said quietly. I have 6 weeks of documented evidence. I have the financial records. I have Paul's reports. I have photographs. I have the hotel receipt from the weekend you spent in Boulder while I was here thinking he was at a work site. I have statements from 2 women in your past who are willing to talk. The room went completely quiet. She had not been prepared for Paul. She had expected grief. She had expected the version of me who cried at movies and brought soup when friends were sick and always led with kindness. She had counted on that version of me to fall apart in a way that would keep me small and reactive while she managed the narrative. "What do you want?" she said. Her voice was different now. The warmth was gone. What was underneath it was something harder and more honest than anything she had shown me in 14 years. "I want you to understand what you've actually done," I said. "You sat next to me in the hospital when I lost a pregnancy. You knew about every IVF consultation. You listened to me talk about whether my marriage was strong enough to survive the grief of that experience, and the entire time you were sleeping with my husband. So when I say what I'm about to say, I need you to understand that I have thought about it very carefully." I set my phone on the coffee table between us. I have given everything Paul compiled to my attorney. The financial documentation is already part of my divorce filing. That protects me legally and financially and ensures there is no ambiguity about fault. That's done regardless of anything else. She watched the phone. But Paul's investigation goes beyond my marriage. The other 2 women, the pattern, the timeline, that's a separate document. I haven't decided yet what to do with it. That depends on you. "You're threatening me," she said. "I'm informing you," I said. "There's a difference, though I understand why you might find it difficult to tell them apart right now." She stood up, and for a moment I thought she was going to leave without another word. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out at the street and said, "You have no idea how hard the last few years have been for me." "I know exactly how hard the last few years have been for you," I said. "You told me. Constantly. I listened. I showed up. I was your person. And now I'm sitting here trying to figure out whether the person I thought I knew was ever real." She turned around and her eyes were wet. I don't know whether the tears were genuine. I genuinely don't know, and that uncertainty is its own kind of grief. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said. It has gone exactly as far as you took it, I said. Step by step, choice by choice. You knew what you were doing. She left 20 minutes later. I sat alone in the house that was half mine and half his and felt something I hadn't expected. Clarity. Not peace exactly, not happiness, but the clean, grounded feeling of someone who has stopped lying to themselves about what they're looking at. My husband moved out that weekend. He didn't fight it. I think he had expected anger and instead found someone who had already done the accounting and arrived at conclusions before he had even finished packing. The divorce process was efficient because I had documentation for everything and my attorney was very good. Colorado is an equitable distribution state, and the financial records I had compiled made the asset division straightforward. The house sold 4 months later. I walked away with what I was entitled to, and not an ounce more. What I hadn't prepared for was my sister. She called me 2 weeks after I filed and said she'd heard from a mutual friend about what was happening. She said she was sorry. Then, in the same breath, she asked whether I was certain I wasn't being hasty. 9 years was a long time. People worked through infidelity. Had I considered counseling? I was quiet for a moment. He was sleeping with my best friend for 8 months, I said. While we were in fertility consultations, she called me from his phone to tell me. I know, my sister said, and I'm not defending it. I don't want you to be alone, and I know how much of your identity has been tied up in this marriage. There it was. Not malice, something worse. Genuine concern shaped entirely around her own fear of watching me fail. She had built her adult life around the belief that I always landed on my feet, and the possibility that I might not this time scared her more than my actual pain did. I am going to be fine, I said, but I need you to support the decision I've already made, not the one that's more comfortable for you. She cried. I let her, and we stayed on the phone for another hour and got somewhere real. The way sisters sometimes do when they stop performing the version of themselves they think the other one needs. It was harder with our shared friend group. My husband and I had built a decade of friendships with other couples in the area, and my best friend was embedded in that network so thoroughly that her presence was almost structural. People liked her. They had relied on her the same way I had. The person who showed up with food, who remembered birthdays, who always made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. When word spread, the group fractured the way those groups always do. Some people chose sides quickly. Others retreated into studied neutrality that felt, in practice, like a quiet endorsement of the status quo. A few reached out to me privately to say they were sorry, which I appreciated, even knowing that their sorry didn't come with any cost to them. One woman, someone I had known only casually before this, sent me a message that said, I'm not sure if this helps at all, but she did something similar in a relationship I was close to, years ago. I stayed quiet because I didn't know how to speak up. I've always regretted it. I'm glad you're not staying quiet. I replied immediately and asked if she'd be willing to talk. She was. We talked for 2 hours. She introduced me to someone else who had a similar story, also from within the broader social circle, also never made public, also settled with silence because silence felt safer than the alternative. 3 of us in total with documented patterns connecting back to the same person. I went back to Paul. I asked him to formalize the secondary documentation, the pattern across relationships with the timelines and connections laid out clearly. He delivered it within 2 weeks. I sent a copy to my attorney and asked her to advise me on options. Then, something unexpected happened. My best friend's employer. She worked in human resources at a regional health network, a job that required significant trust around confidentiality, ethics, and professional conduct. Apparently became aware that questions were circulating. I don't know exactly how. Professional networks in a city the size of Denver are smaller than people realize, and certain information travels through them the way water finds cracks. She called me one afternoon, and her voice had lost every trace of warmth. You talk to people at my company. I haven't spoken to anyone at your company, I said. I've spoken to 2 women who share experiences that involve you. What they chose to do with that information is their decision, not mine. You're trying to destroy my career. I'm trying to ensure I have documentation that protects me in a divorce proceeding, I said. What happens beyond that is a consequence of a pattern. not an action I've taken. There was a long pause. What do you actually want from me? She said. It was the same question she had asked in my living room, but this time it sounded different. Less calculating, more exhausted. I wanted my best friend back, I said. That's what I wanted for 14 years. But she wasn't actually there, so I can't have her. What I want now is for this pattern to stop. I want the women you've done this to before to not feel like they were alone in an experience no one acknowledged. And I want you to understand, really understand, that what you did was not a love story. It was a strategy. And it worked until it didn't. She didn't respond to that. The call ended. She left her position at the health network 3 weeks later. I don't know whether she resigned or was asked to leave. I didn't ask and no one told me. I heard she had moved to another city. Whether the pattern followed her there, I can't say. I hope it didn't. I hope that's not naive. What I know is what I documented. And what I documented is preserved and real and will not disappear the way these things usually do when everyone agrees to call it private and move on. My divorce finalized on a gray afternoon in early February. The conference room at my attorney's office was on the 14th floor, and you could see the front range through the window if the sky was clear. But that day it was overcast. My ex-husband and I signed papers across a long table without looking at each other much. He looked tired in a way I recognized as someone who had not slept well in months. I probably looked the same. When it was done, he asked if he could say something. I said yes. I don't think I understood until recently how completely I let you down, he said. Not just the affair, everything before it. I had been looking outside our marriage for something I should have been building with you, and I told myself it wasn't my fault because things were hard, but it was my fault. I made those choices. I looked at him for a moment. That's true, I said, and I appreciate you saying it. It doesn't change anything, but I appreciate it. I drove home to the apartment I'd rented downtown. 1 bedroom, high ceilings, close to a coffee shop I was becoming a regular at. My name on the lease. My furniture selected without compromise. The first place I had lived alone in 11 years, and it was quieter than I expected it to be, and that quietness was both hard and necessary. I called the woman who had first reached out to me, the one who said she'd regretted staying silent, and I told her the divorce was final. How are you? She asked. Okay, I said. Actually okay, not performed okay. Good, she said. We've stayed in touch. The 3 of us have, in a loose and honest way. We don't have a name for what we are to each other. Not exactly friends, not exactly a support group. More like people who share a specific knowledge about what it costs to refuse silence and who check in on each other because we know the other ones understand. There's something I've thought about a lot in the months since the divorce. The call from my husband's phone, the one she made that afternoon in the parking lot, was supposed to destabilize me. She knew my husband was planning to tell me that night. She got there first, framed it on her terms, made it sound like a kindness, like honesty, like she was the person who loved me enough to tell me the truth. It was a calculated opening move from someone who had done this before and understood that the first narrative usually wins. But she didn't account for the fact that I spend my professional life finding the story underneath the story. She didn't account for Paul, or for the 6 weeks of documentation, or for the women she had left behind who were waiting for someone to ask the right question. She thought she was delivering a blow that would leave me scrambling to make sense of my own life. Instead, she handed me the starting point of the most organized response I've ever built. I don't call it revenge. That's not the right word for it. Revenge is about settling a score, and scores imply a game, and I'm not interested in games. What I did was closer to auditing, finding the actual numbers behind the numbers, presenting the findings in a format that couldn't be disputed, and letting the results speak for themselves. The apartment I live in now faces east. In the morning, the light comes through the windows before I finish my first cup of coffee, and I sit with it for a few minutes before the day starts. There's nothing outside my window that belongs to a version of my life I'm no longer living. There's no evidence of promises that turned out to be conditional. There's just morning and quiet, and the particular satisfaction of someone who looked at a set of numbers that didn't add up and refused to pretend they did. When people ask how I'm doing, I tell them the truth. I'm building something that's actually solid this time. And I know what solid looks like, because I know exactly what the other thing felt like when it started to give way. The thing I keep coming back to is the parking lot, the Whole Foods on Elm Street, a bag of groceries in my arm, her voice coming through my husband's phone like she was doing me a favor. I have replayed that moment so many times, not because it still hurts the way it used to, but because I want to understand the exact shape of what she believed about me. She believed I would fall apart. She had built her entire approach on that assumption, that I was the kind of person who leads with feeling, who would be so blindsided by grief that I wouldn't think to look carefully at what was actually in front of me. She was wrong about that. And what I've come to understand is that she was wrong not because I'm cold, but because I had spent years developing something she hadn't accounted for, the habit of looking at what's real instead of what's comfortable. That's not a talent, it's a practice. It's the thing my career taught me before I ever needed it in my personal life, that the numbers don't care about your feelings, that discrepancies don't resolve themselves because you prefer not to see them, that the only honest way to move through a problem is to look at it directly and without flinching. I had built that skill professionally, and when the moment came, it was available to me. Not because I'm exceptional, because I had chosen, over and over, to do the harder thing when the easier thing was to look away. I think about what it would have looked like if I had done what she expected. If I had called her back that evening crying, asking why. If I had confronted my husband with raw emotion instead of documented evidence. If I had let the first narrative, hers, be the one that defined what happened. I would have lost the divorce settlement I was entitled to. I would have had no record of the pattern. The other women would have stayed silent because no one had given them reason to speak, and she would have moved to the next city, the next social circle, the next marriage, completely intact. What stopped that from happening wasn't anger. It was clarity. It was the decision, made quietly in a parking lot in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, to treat this the way I treated any set of numbers that didn't add up, methodically, patiently, without announcing what I was doing until I had something real to show. There's a version of strength that looks like explosion, raised voices, public confrontation, the kind of drama that signals how much you're hurting. And then there's the version that looks like nothing from the outside, while something very deliberate is being built underneath. The second kind is harder. It requires you to sit across from someone who has wronged you and pass them the salad dressing and ask about their sister's baby while you are, at that exact moment, already 3 weeks into the process of documenting everything they hoped you would never find. It requires you to hold your own grief privately, not because it doesn't matter, but because you have decided that your response matters more than your reaction. I don't think what I did was perfect. I think I made choices in that season that I would make differently if I could. I let things in my marriage go unexamined for longer than I should have, chose comfort over honesty in small moments that accumulated into something I couldn't see clearly until it was already gone. That's not self-blame, it's just true. And the truth, even the uncomfortable parts of it, is the only thing worth building on. What I know now, sitting in this apartment with morning light coming through east-facing windows, is that how you respond to betrayal tells you something important about who you've become. Not who you were when things were easy, but who you are when the ground gives way and you have to decide in real time what you're actually made of. I found out that I am someone who looks at the real numbers, someone who asks the harder question, someone who does not let the first story be the final one. That turned out to be enough.